getting our act together and putting together legislative packets that we're going to be delivered to all the representatives' offices. And basically make the case that science is on our side. We are objective and rational about this, that people will eventually come around and see the light. That's clearly not how things turned out. So we are regrouping a little bit as far as what effective lobbying looks like in the General Assembly. So Representative Alexander is going to speak to us a little bit about what happened, but primarily this is going to be a conversation where he can tell us how he sees things playing out and how we can be most effective as an organization of people who care about this. So, Representative Alexander.
Thank you. Just so you won't think I'm going to be up here talking forever, my entire remarks are on one page of this book. I want to give you a little bit of background about what's been going on. I got to the legislature in the middle of 2008. When I arrived, there was a Representative Earl Jones there who had introduced a couple of pieces of legislation dealing with medical cannabis. One of them would have been a referendum to put it to the vote of the people. And the other was a bill similar to 84, but not as detailed. In that session of the legislature, neither one of those measures went anywhere. They were unable to get any traction. Now, being new to the legislature and being extremely naive, when I first read the bill and looked at the issues, I said, this is a no-brainer. Why haven't we done this? I looked around and I saw what was going on in other states, and I saw that the federal government was moving away from an active enforcement posture to kind of a passive posture to simply allow states to develop their own regimes. So I signed on and quickly found out that there was opposition in both political parties. Not one, but both of them. And we had a general election, and Representative Jones was not returned. And I was faced with whether or not I wanted to continue on that particular fight. And again, not having learned that it's something that has really strange opposition, I dug in and introduced another bill. Now, the one that I introduced was very similar to 84. In fact, there's only one difference between that bill and the one that was introduced this session, and that's at the level of taxation. So that's pretty much an insignificant difference. But the thrust so far has been to figure out how to regulate, how to tax, and how to figure out who can have access in a regulated way. And it's been using the medical marijuana or the medical cannabis route, which incidentally in most states has proven to be the route that has least resistance. And it's proven to be the route that has a whole lot of support. Now, strangely enough, I have found that there are many people around the legislature that if they catch you in the dark of night going through a cypress swamp, they will tell you of their personal knowledge about people in their family who have had various medical conditions that have been helped. They will tell you about doctors who have had patients, especially with cancer and some wasting diseases, who have said to their patients, I know something that could help you, but I can't prescribe it because I go to jail. However, they call it weed. And we arrive at this posture where people know about something, but can only get it by breaking the law. Now, I've received a lot of emails and other kind of correspondence from people who have been really sick, people who have had all kinds of conditions. And I've learned through just reading these personal stories about how some of the legal medications, pain relief and whatnot, how those medications, number one, don't work with everybody, and number two, with certain people over time become less effective, and how these folks are just crying out for some kind of relief. Now, everything I've said up to this point, pretty much I'm sure everybody in here is aware of, and you know people in similar circumstances, and have heard many stories. But one of the things I discovered, not this legislative session, but the last legislative session, by putting a petition up through the MoveOn.org operation, I put it up in November, about the middle of November. And by the end of the year, over 10,000 people have responded to that petition. Most of those who had responded were in North Carolina, though I did get responses from as far away as California. Well, the first thing that told me, whenever you get that kind of response that quickly, and you start looking at where some of these people come from, because a lot of people sent emails. They didn't just sign on to the petition. They sent emails talking about their personal stories. And a lot of these people were from small towns. You know, not a Charlotte, not a Greensboro, not a Winston-Salem, not a Chapel Hill, you know, not an Asheville, places where you might have expected to get a response from, but from Ellerman, Dillon's, the smaller places in North Carolina. And so, I said, well, if folk out in these places are taking the time to respond to this, you've got to have pretty much a groundswell out there of people who won't change. And one of the things I kept telling people is email or call your representative. Well, the reason that I know in that campaign people did it was because representatives would come up to me all the time and say, your folks are clogging my email. I've heard from so-and-so. And some people, through that process, that's when I started getting these stories, these personal stories from people. So I knew that there was a constituency out in North Carolina, and that there was a constituency, not large, but some folk within the legislature, but that they were afraid. Very few people wanted to speak up. Now, either I've been off on the Enterprise in a time capsule or something for the last 20 years and don't quite get it, because quite frankly, I don't. If something is out there that can help sick people, I really don't understand why we restrict access to it. Now, that's me. And when I put that question to other folks, I tend to get a dance. That's what I call it. When somebody changes the subject and goes sideways on you, that's a dance. And the first thing they talk about is, well, what's the position of the medical society? What's the position of the Cancer Society, what is CDC saying about it? So the first challenge, or one of the challenges, is to get more people in the medical community to be willing to speak out. It would be great if the folk at the Lineberger Cancer Institute, a state-supported operation, in some of their research would start talking about what has been found about the retardation of tumor growth, or what's been found out about how appetite can be brought back. But I haven't seen anything coming from them about that. So that's one of the things that we need, I think, to be focusing on. Talking to people within the medical community about trying to get resolutions through some of these societies so that that argument can be effectively removed. Another thing that's important is that people who believe in change in drug policy have got to start becoming engaged in the political process. That means everybody in here who I'm sure is a registered voter, if you're not one, you need to be one very quickly. But it's not just you. Everybody in your family needs to be registered, active in the political process. Everybody that you talk to, you need to start talking political activism. That's engagement. All too often, a lot of folk who are interested in changing drug policy are kind of laid back to the point that they don't want to engage in politics on the front end. But in order to get change within a reasonable period of time, we have to move from what amounts to seminar discussions into political activism. And that starts with getting a lot of people to sign up in the political party of their choice. Now, why do I say it like that? Because under Democratic control of the legislature, this issue went nowhere. Under Republican control of the legislature, this issue has gone nowhere. There have been people in both political parties who have been interested in change. To some extent, it is a generational issue, I believe, where folks of a certain generation want to avoid this discussion altogether, and whereas people of another generation may be willing to engage in it, but don't have the institutional power in order to be able to change anything. And they don't get the institutional power until the issue becomes a more pervasive one in political campaigns. Look at the issue of annexation, which started off essentially when we had Democratic majority control as an issue in the Republican Party, which was at that point the minority party in the General Assembly. The people who were pushing that issue did not give up. They started showing up during the election cycle and raising the issue at forums during that cycle. They started taking notes about who publicly was in favor of their issue, which was annexation reform, and who was not. And once they figured out in their districts that candidate so-and-so was not in favor of it, they started organizing against that candidate in favor of somebody who said that they were in favor of it. And yeah, that's called one-issue politics, which when I wear my political science hat, I tell you is terrible for democracy in America. but when I'm wearing my issue politics hat, it's one of the only ways to get people to take you seriously. So, what does that mean practically? It means in the election cycle that is coming up, you've got to show up at forums and you've got to ask questions about drug policy. Now, so far, what's tested well in North Carolina is changing our laws to deal with medical cannabis. So my suggestion is that's where you start. You ask candidates about medical cannabis. And if they say that they are opposed to changing the law, you've got to ask them the follow-up, which is why? Why specifically aren't you in favor of or won't you work to change the law? It's been my observation that when you get people engaged in that kind of discussion, it's hard for them to support their position. And that's what you want to do. You want to start making it uncomfortable for politicians to duck, dodge, go sideways, tap dance around these issues of changing drug policy. That also means that the old, it's a Schedule I substance, which is an answer that you will also get. That means that you've got to ask people who are running for Congress whether or not they're going to be in favor of passing legislation that will move it off of Schedule I. There's a bill in Congress right now that would do that. A measure has been introduced to try to make some kind of change just about every session of Congress going back for at least a decade. And it goes about nowhere. And it doesn't get anywhere for some of the same reasons that you have problems here in the North Carolina legislature. You got an institutional bias. Well, how do you change an institutional bias? You change it by sending people to Congress with a different mindset, which means that in the various forums and discussions that are held where congressional candidates show up, you've got to raise the same issues. Which means at some point, you've got to hold forums to which you invite candidates so that their views can be discussed openly. Now I'm going to tell you, for forums, this is a good crowd. Because during campaign season, you often are invited to forums that on paper sound like, you know, they're great and there's going to be a lot of people there, and you and 3 other folks show up. And you know, and you see something in the newspaper that says so-and-so group had a political forum. They never tell you how many people were there. So this is a good crowd. And you have affiliates, chapters, whatever you want to call them, in some critical places around the state. And they ought to be sponsoring forums during the political season to invite people like me who want your vote to come in and engage in a discussion, to answer some questions about our views, to let you know what we think about things, to specifically ask somebody, well, in the last session of the General Assembly, there was a bill introduced that would have done blase, 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 and why didn't you support it? Well, what does that mean? Well, you can support a measure in the General Assembly by co-sponsoring it. You don't have to be a primary sponsor. You can sign on as a co-sponsor. Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so, you didn't co-sponsor the measure. Why not? That's an uncomfortable question because it has a yes or no answer. And it's hard to hide behind yes or no answers when you don't want to answer at all. And see, another thing is, if you don't have a forum, and if you aren't issuing invitations, you're giving these folk a pass. Don't give them a pass. And if they don't show up, be sure to publicize that we asked all the Democratic and the Republican candidates for so-and-so office to show up and to engage in a reasoned and rational Q&A with us on these important issues of the day. And so-and-so showed up and didn't. And that's important because the citizenry is changing its viewpoint on what the law ought to be. And when you start publicizing what candidates' views are, pro or con, John Q. Citizen, who may never come to your forum, who may never say anything to anybody down the block, but who, when they go to that voting booth, will have in their minds, based upon the importance to them of this issue, that they should vote for or against somebody. And remember, because medical cannabis deals with a lot of chronic diseases and conditions, you don't know who secretly may be in favor of a change of the law and who is looking for some direction about who out there in political la-la land can support them. So forums is one concrete thing. Another concrete thing, taken from the page of the annexation people, is the Legislative Action Day. The North Carolina Cannabis Network spearheaded an action day on February the 12th of this year. And I would say about 300 to 400 people showed up. Scared the bejeebus. I have never seen in my life the kind of reaction to a group of well-mannered citizens who come knocking on your door, and many of them had appointments. I suggested to them, just don't show up. You know, call and make an appointment. Because one time a few activists showed up, and one legislator was so intimidated that he called the security folk because he thought he was under siege in his office. I mean, after all, here were some ex-veterans, and you know, and they wanted to talk about marijuana. My God! I mean, in the General Assembly, they're gonna hem me up in my office, and I'm gonna get a contact high. Now, hey, first off, you are a citizen. The North Carolina Constitution enshrines the right of citizens to petition for redress of grievances. In plain English, that means if you want the law to be changed, you have a right to talk to somebody in this representative republic who is in a position to try to get that law changed. That's your right as a citizen. That's one of the reasons that legislative action days work. I was not in favor of some of the changes that they made in the annexation law. I thought the old law was pretty okay. But I respected the right of the people who wanted it to change to come up and petition. Oh, they all wore red T-shirts, and you know they walked around, and one day they packed the gallery, and they made appointments with everybody. Now remember, I'm opposed to the legislation, but yet I hosted a number of folk who wanted to try to get my opinion changed. We sat down and we talked. And I listened to their point of view, and then I explained to them my point of view. And though we did not ever agree, we agreed to disagree. That's the way the system is supposed to work. Now this time, Representative Paul Stam was quoted widely in the press as saying that they were annoyed by the calls, the requests for appointments, the emails, and I guess the 300 and some odd folk walking around politely wanting to talk to them about legislation. I submit to you that one of the ways to demonstrate that citizens are concerned and are on board for change is to take that small number that showed up in February and multiply it. Every session of the Assembly, you need to have a legislative action day. And the numbers need to move from 300 to 600 to 1,000 to 1,500 to as many folk as you can get to come up and spend some time expressing your views on what needs to change. There's a mall called the Halifax Mall that is on one side of the General Assembly building. It's about the size of the football field. Now, I'm here to tell you, if you could ever pack that mall with people, peacefully assembled, during the time that the legislature is meeting, to demonstrate citizen concern for a change in drug policy, you will be sending a powerful message. And that's a challenge, because you can't get that many people there without some work. You got to talk to folks. You got to be able to organize the transportation. You got to have some good speakers. And you got to try to get some folk within the political establishment who are interested in change to be willing to address the group. The rules within the legislature means that during the next short session, which is next year, we cannot introduce legislation on the same topic or that substantially has the same provisions in it. Okay? But that means that after the 2014 election, new legislation can be introduced. Now, the other thing that's restrictive in the short session is the topics of legislation. You're basically dealing with budget modifications, tax policy, that kind of thing. So it's very hard to get at this kind of issue within the confines of the rules during the next session. However, what you can do still is plan to have a legislative action day and try to target to get at least 1,000 folk to show up. and make those appointments to talk to your legislators. Now, why might that be important? Because the short session is before the next election. And if you follow that up with forums, you see, if people see that here's a large mass of folks who took the time out to come to Raleigh and to engage on this issue, when they knew that there was no bill in front of the legislature, they're motivated. And if they're that motivated, my jeebus, they just might be voting. And remember, this is a bipartisan issue. I have been surprised at the number of libertarians who are generally registered as Republicans who are interested in this issue. This is the only thing that Ron Paul and I have to agree on. You know, you talk about opposite ends of the political spectrum. But on this one, he's right. It does boil down to an issue of personal liberty. And that is one of the arguments that I believe some of the people in the GOP are going to be responsive to, because they argue personal liberty on a whole host of issues. So what have I said so far? I've said, number one, you got to get more doctors, nurses, hospitals, medical institutes in North Carolina to speak out on the efficacy of cannabis as a medication. And incidentally, it was prescribed as a medication prior to 1932. And then it took from 1932 to about 1951 to get us to where we are right now. So when you look at it in that perspective, understand this is a shift that you can't turn around instantly. It takes time. It took them time to get us to where we are now. It's going to take us time to get some change. But we'll get there. So that's number one. Number two, think about a legislative action day. And in order to get 1,000 people or 1,000 or more people, you start now to organize. You pick a day, you do the things that you need to get the Halifax Mall, you know, you get the stage up so that you can have a very large rally. And during that rally, to make it visually exciting, try to get everybody to, you know, wear something. Maybe a green t-shirt. You know, maybe somebody's waving one of those flags with that strange leaf on it. But the important thing is you are citizens. You see, the Tea Party has this mystique that they are the true American patriots. And they're trying to convince everybody that they've cornered the market on patriotism and cornered the market on the expression of true American values. That's not the way I read American history. And because that's not true American history, you too are inheritors of our ability to change things by getting the people involved. Legislative Action Day forums. Now I tell you, I'm seriously thinking about working on doing a drug policy conference at one of the universities. And so you guys are the first folk I've had a chance to test this on. Do you think that would be something that you'd be interested in being involved with?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, see, it's my feeling that the more you get people to talk about reality as opposed to mythology, that's how you help to get change. The first time I talked to some folk within the legislature, about this, I told them that one of the important things you got to do is change optics. The optics on this issue right now are, depending upon your age, Cheech and Chong, or Kumar. Yeah, take your choice. They're all entertaining. But the point is that when a legislator who has in his or her mind a particular stereotypical image is confronted with somebody who does not match that stereotype, they taught me in school that something called cognitive dissonance starts. And the more you can create this dissonance between what they believe, have been told, and therefore think, and the reality, they begin to question the operative assumptions under which they now do things. But the thing that really holds them in place is not logic. It is fear of being primaried by those who are in charge, because they are not towing the political line. Which means that you have to reach out, if you are a Democrat or an independent, to your political brothers and sisters in the Republican Party. Now see, I have on purpose not asked anybody what their registration is, because this is not a partisan issue. It just isn't. I can tell you that the Democratic Party for several years now has had a plank in its platform that supports legislation to change our drug laws to make medical cannabis legal. The last time I looked, the Republican Party had not crossed that Rubicon. I can tell you that the existing chairman of the Democratic Party indeed showed up at the legislature and indeed addressed the 300 or 400 folk who were there on February 12th and spoke in favor of changing the laws. They waited and waited, but the Republican chairman didn't show up. Now, I honestly don't know if he was invited, but his office is right down the street from the legislature. You got the Democratic office closest, and then about 6 blocks further down, you got the Republican office. So, it's not like you can't get there. But you gotta make this bipartisan. And everybody knows somebody in the political party. And you've got to make sure that those folk in that party raise the issues in that party's forums, at their state conventions, on their state executive committees. You got the idea is to find folk who are in these places and talk to them. See where you can come up with allies, so that this discussion isn't just a discussion of your friends, people who've been, with you all along, but the discussion bubbles out. So we've got forums as a possibility, a drug policy conference is a good possibility, a legislative action day, you visiting forums and other organizations are hosting during the election cycle. And lastly, is 2 strategies. do everything you can to make sure that your core supporters vote. And vote for candidates who consciously have committed to change. That means get them out and do an early vote. If they're going to be, traveling somewhere out of the country, make sure that they vote absentee. If they want to wait to traditional election day, give them a call. Make sure that they vote that day. That something had to stop them from voting. If you fail to participate, if you fail to support the candidates who are interested in your issue, then you lose by default. And candidates need support in a number of ways. They need volunteers to man the polls on election day. They need volunteers to stand out in front of the early voting sites. That's hard work. And it's sometimes thankless work. And it makes your feet sore. And it causes your voice to go hoarse sometimes. But it's the only way to convince voters. You'll be surprised the number of people who arrive at the polling place with their minds unmade up. And sometimes that piece of literature or that 30 or 40 seconds that you get to say something to somebody, or longer if it's a long line, may be the deciding factor. So you've got to be prepared to engage. The other thing that you've got to be prepared to do is to contribute to candidates, because campaigns do not run on volunteers alone. Campaigns also have to run on money. Campaign signs do not print themselves. Ads on radio stations, television, they do not donate them to candidates. All of that stuff costs money. Billboards, money. Somebody, I saw some buttons over here. They didn't print themselves either. T-shirts, they don't print themselves. All of this is the paraphernalia of modern campaigning. And in order to get your point across, you've got to turn out in the appropriate paraphernalia so your optics are right. And you've got to identify those candidates who ultimately are will be prepared to vote for change. Because if you keep voting for the same people, you're going to get the same result.
I've got to ask, are there candidates like that?
Sure.
Besides you.
If you look at who signed on to 84, those would be some candidates who are like that. There's a strategy that I have been debating about whether or not to call for a particular parliamentary maneuver that would give us an opportunity to see who might be, beyond the small number of people who signed on the bill, who might be willing to go on record as in favor of at least having a debate. But the nature of the General Assembly and the way it works makes some of that increasingly difficult. And I haven't quite figured out yet whether or not it's going to be worth the attempt, because there is another parliamentary maneuver that the majority can instantly go into to squash the vote. So we're trying to figure this one out. Okay, I have talked long enough. Anybody got any questions?
I was just wondering if you've had a one-on-one conversation with Tom to tell us about this topic.
No, I haven't.
He's announced that he's leaving as Speaker of the House, so he's seems like it's difficult to find politicians during campaigns who are willing to go on the record favoring a medical cannabis bill. Whereas we have these behind-the-scenes opponents. Now, I guess the meeting that took place, the rules calendar on February 20th, there was only one person who spoke in opposition to House Bill 84.
That is correct.
A gentleman by the name of Jerry Boyle. He was the only one. And I guess Paul Stam killed the bill. It didn't seem like there was any discussion.
Well, technically, there were two measures in front of the committee. One dealt with banning toplessness in Asheville, which is a whole other. Incidentally, mooning is still legal in North Carolina. That was one of the major things that we learned in that discussion. And after that was disposed of, we had roughly, I don't know, 25 minutes of discussion on the bill. Everybody, as you said, everybody that spoke, except for the last speaker, was in favor of it. Now, because it was a committee, now you have to understand, I presented the bill to the committee. I am not a member of the committee, and as such, I could not call for division. So there is no record of how the vote went. It was a voice vote.
We have a recording, but I don't think WRAL had its camera. If they had their cameras running, it certainly didn't make the evening news. So you kind of got a situation where the media basically just, they ignore it and nobody knows about what happened.
Well, my gut on this is that the Democrats voted in favor and the Republicans generally voted against.
Yeah.
Though, if you are standing at the podium, it appeared that the folk on the right-hand side voted in favor of the bill going forward, and the folk on the left-hand side were against the bill going forward. Now, there were one or two Republicans on the right-hand side, and again, because it's a voice vote, I'm not sure how they voted or if they voted, because there's no requirement that you actually vote at the committee level.
It was kind of difficult to ascertain what politicians, what the elected officials, the House members, I guess, were there some Senate members there too?
No, this is
This
a House committee.
Since there was no questions asked or nobody commented, it was kind of difficult to figure out what people's views were on that committee.
Which is a clear indication that away from this meeting, probably in their caucus, the Republicans had decided that they were going to produce an unfavorable. And what happens when you produce an unfavorable is that it takes a 2/3 vote to get a measure off of the unfavorable calendar. But because if you do that, the measure essentially now is ready for floor debate. If you don't want a floor debate in the first place, because once you get into a floor debate, anybody that wants to speak pretty much has an opportunity to speak. You will do whatever you can parliamentarily to keep that kind of vote from ever happening. And I figured, if I figured out how to keep it from happening, they definitely know how to keep it from happening. So that's why we kind of had a very strange pass within the rules of the General Assembly.
Yes, sir. There's been two polls that I know of so far that have shown support for a similar measure that range from 58 up to 70% support across the state. Now, just based upon your experience, when somebody who's normally opposed to such a bill sees those type of numbers, I mean, do they really just blow it off and say, I don't care what the general public feels, this is the way I'm going to vote? Or do they actually listen to their constituents and do what, I mean, really they're kind of supposed to do and be a voice for their constituents?
Well, I have two answers. The first answer is, when you see that the citizenry overwhelmingly is in favor of change, that happens to help conversion. Especially if your polling shows that some of the citizenry in your district is in favor of the measure and is likely to use your position on it as a deciding factor as to whether or not to return you to the legislature. And that's why I've said it's a bipartisan issue, because my interaction with a lot of rank-and-file Republicans, a lot of rank-and-file conservatives, have shown me that they are in favor. And a number of them, I believe, will vote their convictions. But information about the extent to which people are in favor of this change isn't getting out. That's why I suggested some of these other things that you need to do, because that helps to get the information out. And that helps to change minds. And there will always be a group of people who, regardless of the evidence, will not change their point of view.
Yes, sir. Representative Alexander, I think that people in this part of the country are aware that there's a lot of people for years who have voted dry and drank wet. And there's many people who, there's situations in counties where there have been referendums on the subject of alcohol sales. And there's an uneasy alliance between the preachers who have their billboards paid for by the moonshiners or the bootleggers. Is there a secret opposition in this thing? I mean, are breweries, or is there political money that sort of suppresses public will in this issue?
I've had people tell me that they thought the pharmaceutical industry was against it. I personally don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is that if you have a regulated system for production and distribution, people with money will figure out how rapidly to make some money in the production end. Other people will figure out how to do things in the distribution end.
How about taxation?
Well, I figure right now, if my bill had passed, North Carolina would pick up in 12 months anywhere between a low of 45 million to a high of almost 100 million, which is money that we could use to do a lot of positive things.
Well, that brings up the whole subject of, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's not being taxed. So there's a lot of people that don't want this to ever be legalized. And being the mother of 4 kids that have been to several different universities, they have told me that it's easier to get a dime bag than it is a Domino's pizza. And it's true. But as far as the medicinal reason why somebody would need it for cancer or people that have been in hospice, I mean, so many lives have been touched with people that have suffered with hospice and cancer. Instead of trying to get a doctor to risk his reputation for an illegal issue because we're in the Bible Belt or because of what their church might think or their clients ruin their reputation, why not get hospice volunteers to talk about the pain and sympathy from the people, and that would actually bring it together and take out the politics and bring in the humanity. Because I think that's where it comes down to. Forget the politicians, because there always are going to be the alcohol lobbyists that have the money, but you're never going to get the money from the individuals that have the good money coming from this industry, because they're making it now without tax. Why should they go out and lobby for it? That's insane.
Understand. I mean, you've hit on a couple of things. First, the hospice idea, I think, is great. Because there's a network of hospices all over the state, and there's a hospice association. And some of the better hospices are associated with hospitals.
And they will speak out, and they will tell you how painful it is for these individuals to go through, and really hit on a lot of politicians that have had a loved one suffer. And that's
Like I
why
said, that's an excellent idea, which I'm going to add to my quickly.
Thank you.
But the other thing is, you know who makes the most money off of the status quo? It's not the drug companies, it's the cartels.
Yeah,
And
they don't want it legalized.
no, they don't, because they make several $1 billion just on marijuana sales in North America. And if every state legalized just medical marijuana, they would end up losing anywhere from 30 to 50% of their sales. That's a couple $1 billion. So if anybody has an interest in maintaining the status quo, it's them. Yes, sir.
The problem with the pharmaceuticals, though, is that pharmaceutical companies are really not interested in anything that has to do with cures or solutions. They are not going to make more money off of marijuana being made legal for medical purposes, because what they do is try to create diseases and causes that we need to take more pills, but they're not really, the last thing they cured was polio, and they decided that's never going to happen. You know, there's diseases that don't even really exist that we're being told we need to take medicine for every day. So the pharmaceutical companies are strongly opposed to it, and I don't believe the cartels are as strongly opposed as you believe, because over the last course of 20 years, most of the marijuana consumed in this country has grown. I mean, in this country has grown in this country. We don't have a whole lot of Mexican and Colombian weed being smuggled in. The cartel now are more into smuggling people and smuggling cocaine and stuff like that than marijuana like in the 70s and so forth. But I think what we need to focus, maybe especially in North Carolina, is through the churches. Because if you could have forums set up in churches and convince preachers and pastors that this is the direction to go, then they're going to start preaching that to their congregations as well. And that's, even though there's supposed to be separation of church and state, a lot of people in this state vote on whatever their preacher tells them they should vote. And that, you know, it would be so easy to have forums with churches and sit down and convince them that it's the right move, that it's not all about, you know, I mean, it really starts with hemp. You know, they've got the whole country scared that hemp is going to be, you know, the scourge of the country. And, you know, there's a guy that makes hempcrete in Asheville, and he has to have they eradicate the seeds coming from Canada. You know, we're importing billions of dollars worth of hemp from Canada, China, Europe, and it's ridiculous to think that, you know, the mindset of America, you don't get high on hemp. I mean, there's nobody running around the streets smoking hemp, you know, but yet it's so, they're so frightened that they even keep that illegal, you know, so we've got a few hurdles to overcome, but if you could change the populace thinking, it's not about getting high, it's about helping people, it's about helping the planet, it's about helping the economy, and that's where it all comes from.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting about the history of hemp, that one of the reasons that we ended up going away from its use in this country was because it competed with cotton sail makers.
Right.
And we produce cotton. That group was entrenched, and we have an excellent history in America of unifying competition and stomping on it before it can, get too out there. And that's one of the things that happened. And hemp is used around the world, and we have to, for legal uses in this country, it's imported. And it is a product that could be grown here easily. But one of the groups inside of America to this day that are opposed to it is law enforcement. And I read an interesting quote about that. And the quote was, we can't tell the difference between the folk who would be growing hemp for the industrial market and the folks who would be growing marijuana for stuff that's still not legal.
They look like different plants.
Yeah, completely different.
I'm telling you, they're quoted, law enforcement. But that's what they're quoted as saying over and over and over. Yes, sir.
In an effort to put building blocks in place as quickly as possible, the state of Alabama has that approach. By the end of this year, they're going to have 5 different bills set up, one for recreational, one for medical, one for industrial hemp, one that's designed just to protect doctors so they can have conversations with their patients. I forgot what the, you think some approach like that would work in North Carolina?
It would work if the rules in the House were changed. Right now, every legislator is limited to introducing 10 bills in a 2-year period. Yeah, that surprised me too. But when the GOP came in, one of their reforms was to limit the number of bills that anybody can introduce so that they said we wouldn't be clogged up with a whole lot of measures that might never be heard in the committee and would help stretch the sessions out. So every time you make a decision about being the primary sponsor on a